Welcome to TFE Talks, Navigating Wealth, Business, and Legacy, the podcast from Thomas Fisher and Edwards. Each episode, our attorneys bring you expert insight on estate planning, business strategy, and legacy building, breaking down complex topics into clear, actionable advice. Whether you're solidifying a strategy we've discussed or preparing for what's next, this podcast is your resource for thoughtful, practical planning. You ready? Let's dive in.
Hello and welcome to another edition of TFE Talks. I'm your host, Jordan Goewey, joined again today by Parker Baker, an associate here at Thomas Fisher and Edwards in Greenville, South Carolina. Parker, nice to have you on the podcast once again.
Jordan, thank you for having me again.
Parker, you've been on a few times now to talk with us about business-related topics, and today is again something that I think is largely related to our business advising practice, though it does tie into our estate planning practice in some parts as well. And so we're going to talk about 754 elections. And so that's a number that I'm throwing out there. And so that probably makes some people worried because they know that we're probably about to talk about a section of the tax code, and we are, but I think you'll be able to make this issue pretty approachable for everyone today. So why don't you start by telling us what is a 754 election and in what context or what couple of contexts does it arise?
Yeah, so like you said, Section 754, it's a provision under the Internal Revenue Code, and it's an election that you can make to help adjust the inside basis of assets after an applicable transfer of a partnership interest occurs. This could be a partner buying into a partnership. This could be a partnership interest passing at the death of a partner to a new partner.
And so I do know that this can be a complex topic. You've got the death of a partner or a partner transfers their interest. And then you have this idea of, can we make a 754 election to adjust the inside basis? So obviously, in order to understand how this is important, we're going to need you to explain to us what is inside basis and of course, what is outside basis as well. And so why don't you go ahead and walk us through those concepts a little bit here?
Sure. So I'll start first with inside basis. Inside basis is simply the partnership's basis in its assets, right? On the other hand, outside basis is a partner's basis in his or her partnership interests. Ideally, the two of these are the same. In many ways, the tax law treats a partnership as an aggregate of the partners. But in certain circumstances, the inside basis or a partner's share of the inside basis and their outside basis cannot match, right? We can get some sort of disparity that occurs. A transfer of a partnership interest, whether by sale or by the death of a partner, that can create one of these disparities between inside and outside basis. This can cause issues because, say, there's a transfer, there's a step up, either a cost basis or at death a fair market value basis for the new partner for the outside basis, but there wouldn't be for the inside basis. So if the partnership were to go ahead and sell the asset, right, there might be gain to that new partner that they wouldn't otherwise recognize, right? They may be able to later sort of recoup some of that gain on a liquidation of their interest in the partnership. But at least initially, when that asset is sold out of the partnership, there's gain that's recognized that really shouldn't be recognized for that new partner, because they really should get basis credit in the assets, not just in their partnership interest.
So Parker, I'll try to keep kind of stepping this back and giving my understanding of what you're saying, just to kind of aid the listener some. So when I have an interest in a partnership, and maybe that's an LLC that's taxed as a partnership, I have outside basis, which is my basis in my actual partnership interest. Maybe it's what I paid for it. Maybe it's what, if it was gifted to me, maybe it's what I carried over from the prior owner. But I've got that outside basis in the partnership interest. And then the partnership has basis in each of its assets that it owns, depending on what type of partnership. If it's owning rental properties, it's got basis in the various rental properties or whatever other assets that it has. And then we sometimes have tax events happen when there's a mismatch between those two things. And so then we have the idea of the 754 election that comes into play, as you mentioned before, if a partner dies, if a partner transfers their interest. And so why don't you tell me, let's start with when they sell their interest. If a partner sells their interest, why might a 754 election be relevant, and who makes that election and who does it benefit?
Yeah. So the 754 election is made by the partnership. And I think we may talk more about this later, but once it's made, it can be revoked with the consent of the IRS. It's unlikely they would give it except in a special circumstance. But after it's made, every time there's a triggering event, right? A sale, the death of a partner, the gift of a partnership interest, that it will automatically sort of book up the partnership's inside basis in its assets with respect to that particular partner. So what it does is it says, hey, I know that you got this new outside basis when you were coming into the partnership because you bought it and you have a cost basis, or you received it after death and you have that fair market value date of death basis. What we're going to do for your share of the inside basis, so if it's a two-person partnership, we would say for half of each asset, essentially, that particular partner is going to get a stepped up basis with respect to each of those assets. It doesn't affect the overall partnership's basis in its assets, its overall inside basis, and it doesn't affect the other partner's share of the inside basis in the assets, but it is particular to the new partner, and it allows for a basis step up over those assets so that if there is for instance, a sale event of the partnership's assets and they sell the rental real property that you talked about, that new partner isn't going to be subject to gain that isn't really economically that partner's.
Yeah, and so from what I hear there, if a partner sells an interest, maybe that election can be made by the partnership, but then the election is permanent essentially. So if another partner were to die in the same tax year, then the election is still going to apply. Is there any difference in how this occurs if a partner dies, or if no election had been made prior to a partner dying?
It's the same if the 754 election is in effect.
And so, really, if the election is in effect, then any sort of transfer of the interest, any sort of partner dying, any of that is going to apply. And so, are there negative things that can happen if an election is in place and there are multiple events that occur while the election is in place?
So I think the one negative that you can have with the 754 election is that we always like to talk about the step up in basis, but there is the potential for a step down in basis.
Yeah.
But we'll note this is mitigated a little bit by the partnership tax rules. So there is the same function that happens with the 754 election where they adjust that inside basis for the new partner. That happens if you have the 754 election, if we talked about. It also happens automatically if you have what's called a substantial built-in loss at the time of that particular transfer. So if there's more than $250,000 of loss that would be in there, you automatically have to do this new basis for the partnership's assets. So sort of the incentive to not make the election is sort of lessened a little bit because, it benefits you if there's gain, and you can't really get the benefit of the loss unless the loss is less than $250,000.
So there can be downsides in some circumstances, but often the 754 election is a good thing. And I think it's particularly a good thing if I own a partnership interest and I die while owning it, because I will want my beneficiaries to be able to benefit from getting a stepped up basis over the inside basis of the assets in addition to the outside basis. But you noted before that the election is actually made by the partnership. So how is that election actually made? And what happens if the partnership fails to make the election? And I suppose in that scenario that I just described, where I'm really wanting my beneficiaries to get the benefit of this, am I really just relying on the other partners to make sure that my beneficiaries get that benefit?
Yeah, so the way that the 754 election is made, like I said, it's an election that's made by the partnership, and it needs to be made in conjunction with filing the Form 1065 for instance the trigger, if the triggering event is death for that year of that particular partner's death. If that is late, there like many other avenues in the code, there's potentially late relief that can be afforded by the IRS for that, but there needs to be reasonable cause for that filing being late.
And so, Parker, there are a lot of benefits that can come from a 754 election. There are also some downsides that you touched on earlier. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see when it comes to planning around a potential 754 election?
I think the biggest one is the one that you might expect, is that nobody ever took the time to actually make the election. And like we said, in the absence of making that election, there isn't that step up for the partner's share of the inside basis. And when that happens, maybe there's gain recognized for that new partner that wouldn't otherwise have been recognized if the election had been timely filed. And I really think that's the big one, is just being aware, being on the ball, and making sure all the members of the team sort of are aware. The accountant and the attorney are working together, and when a partner passes away, that somebody has the knowledge to be able to point people in the right direction to say, hey, you need to talk to your accountant about making the 754 election if it's not already in place for that partnership.
Yeah, certainly. And that already touches on some of this, but what is the key takeaway for a business owner or an advisor if we're giving them the practical advice that they seek from today's podcast? What's the key takeaway that they should take from this idea of 754 elections, planning around it, and looking for opportunities to use it?
I think, for one, it's just awareness that this is something that needs to be planned for, whether that is, hey, somebody in the partnership passed away. Should we go ahead and make the 754 election? Will that benefit my heirs later on down the line? Maybe thinking as you go talk to a lawyer to maybe set up a new business that you're going to have taxed as a partnership. Do we need to have that negotiated as part of the operating agreement, that the LLC, for instance, under the operating agreement, will make that election if there's the death of a partner or the sale of a partnership interest?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that those are great things to look for. And I especially like that idea of, can we actually plan for this in advance and get it in writing? Going back to something we talked on a little earlier in the podcast, I'm not relying on my beneficiaries having to convince my other business partners that they need to make this election that will ultimately benefit my beneficiaries or whoever receives my interest in the partnership. And so I think that type of foresight can really be helpful for this, so that you can address things early. And so, Parker, thanks again for joining me today. I know that this is a very complex topic, but I think it's one that you did a good job of breaking down in an understandable way for us. And so I look forward to having you on future episodes of the podcast so that we can continue to work through all of these planning ideas.
Sure. Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks for listening to TFE Talks. For more information, please visit our website at www.tfelawfirm.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram by clicking the links below in the show notes. If you have any questions about topics discussed in the episode, or you have recommendations for future topics, please email us at info@tfelawfirm.com. See you next time.